Guys, I think you're going to be in for an interesting treat this afternoon. Our speaker this afternoon is Jerry Roberts, all the way from Deep River. But Jerry's background is rather interesting. He is both the writer, the maritime historian, and museum director, or executive. How many of you have been to How many of you have been to New York and been on the Intrepid? He was the director of exhibits and research for that museum for some years. Then he decided to come back. His family was originally from Connecticut, and he became the director of the Connecticut River Museum down in Essex. And while he was there, he made some discoveries about that town. And the discoveries are what we're going to talk about today: the British raid on Essex, the forgotten battle of the War of 1812. Jerry?
Yeah. Can you hear me with this?
No.
Okay, let's just get this in the screen here. Okay, so thank you for inviting me here. Lou apologized that they didn't have a big turnout today. This feels like a very big turnout to me, so I think I'm very happy to be here. I live just down the river a bit in Deep River, which is right next to Essex. And I came here 8 years ago from 30 years in Manhattan. And I've been a historian most of my adult life. And it's very rare that a historian gets to discover something new. And I was fortunate enough to do that here. When I arrived in Essex, how many of you have been to Essex? Oh, it's a beautiful little town, isn't it? So they have this parade every year, a Fife and Drum Corps parade. It's called Commemoration Day, but a lot of people call it Losers' Day parade. But no one quite knew what it was about. Something about the British coming and stealing our rum or something like that. And so, as the bicentennial of the War of 1812 approached, I set out to get to the bottom of what this battle was and to find out how come Essex had never been really recognized for this. And I was able to get some good grants from both the state and the federal government. And over the course of 6 years, we did a lot of research on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. We did a lot of archaeology, and we found, to our surprise, it was the largest battle in the history of Connecticut. It was the largest single maritime loss to the United States during the entire War of 1812, yet it had been left out of the history books. So this is the untold story of the British raid on Essex. Oops, just a second here.
Come back.
We've got a problem here. This is not playing in sequence at all. Let me just try one other thing real quick. Okay, so Essex, as you can see, is 6 miles up the Connecticut River. We are halfway between Boston and New York, and we're on the edge of Long Island Sound. I call Essex Brigadoon. When you drive into Essex, it really feels like the land that time forgot. On our main street, which has about 30 houses, 24 of those houses were standing during the War of 1812. And half of those were standing before the Revolution. It's a beautiful little town. It's a peninsula sticking out into the Connecticut River. On April 8th, we got together for the 200th anniversary of the British raid on Essex. We had a big bonfire on the beach. The town gathered, and we threw 27 little wooden ships into the fire and read off the names of the 27 ships that the British burned. A few weeks later, on May 10th, we did our 200th commemoration day. Fife and drums, we had 15 corps of fife and drums with bagpipes, and 3,000 people came. We had the normal speeches that you'd expect at these things. And then we had some uninvited guests. We had put together a team of reenactors of British Marines, and they stormed the town as the horrified people looked on. They captured our first selectman. And worse yet, they took over the Griswold Inn. The Griswold Inn has been open for business for 200 years, and the British actually did occupy it in 1814, and the reenactors occupied it again. So why did the British come to the sleepy little village up the Connecticut River? It began when the War of 1812 began. A man named Stephen Decatur, one of our great naval heroes, early in the war, captured the HMS Macedonian out of the Atlantic. He brought it back to New London. It was very badly damaged. And then he brought it to New York. And it was recommissioned as the USS Macedonian. And then he was in command of the USS United States, one of our big frigates, a sister ship of the Constitution. And then another officer was in charge of the USS Hornet. So in April of 1813, we had 3 naval officers with 3 powerful British American warships in our harbor. And they wanted to get out to sea where they could do more damage to the British. So they headed out on April 9th, but were blocked by a large British squadron. So what Decatur did is he took the back door out of New York, which is through Long Island Sound, a 90-mile trip through the Sound and out into the Atlantic this way. Meanwhile, the British raced on the outside. So it was literally a race between 2 powerful squadrons of who could get to Montauk Point first. When Stephen Decatur and his squadron came through and rounded Montauk Point on June 1st, they found the British waiting for them. They had to turn tail and run up into New London, which had powerful forts. And sure enough, Decatur and the American squadron was now safe from the British squadron. But of course, they were just trapped as much as they were in New York. But now they were up in New London. President Madison issued a decree that any American citizen that could destroy a British warship of the blockading squadron would be awarded half its value. Now imagine if a couple of you guys got together one night and went out and destroyed the USS Nimitz and were given half its value. Pretty equivalent thing, destroying a British 74-gun warship. But it attracted a bunch of young bucks out of Stonington and Mystic to come out and load guns, rowboats full of gunpowder and sailboats, and even create a couple of little wooden submarines, and they attacked the British off of New London. And finally, on the night of March 24th, a bomb went off underneath the bow of the HMS La Hogue. Now, the bomb didn't destroy the hull, but it certainly ticked off the captain, Captain Capel. And they sent out boats, and they found an American rowing around in a little dinghy at 3:30 in the morning in Long Island Sound with muffled oars, saying he was just out there for a row. They nicknamed him Torpedo Jack and slapped him in irons. Any floating bomb in those days was called a torpedo. This was long before the days of the propellers and torpedoes. So any floating bomb was called a torpedo. So Torpedo Jack, a mysterious American, is going to get hung. Well, he goes to the British commander. He says, "Commander, I can offer you something for my life." There's a village which we now call Essex, which was then called Pettipog. And we were building privateers. Privateers are privately owned warships. The government would allow private citizens to raise money, commission a warship, go out and attack British merchant ships, and they could actually keep the value of the cargoes that they took. It was kind of legalized nationalized piracy in a way. So Torpedo Jack said, if you go to Pettipog, you'll be able to burn a bunch of these privateers. And the British knew they couldn't get up to Pettipog because of the big sandbars at the mouth of the Connecticut River. And Torpedo Jack said, "I will guide you up if you spare my life." And Captain Capel said, "Not only will we spare your life, but if you can get us into Pettipog so we can burn the privateers, we'll reward you handsomely." So Pettipog is 6 miles up the Connecticut River from Long Island Sound. There's big sandbars at its mouth. Even today, the sandbars are still there. It was only in the late 1800s that a channel was dredged through. So Captain Capel chose a commander, this young man named Richard Coote, a British officer, to lead the raid up to burn the privateers of Pettipog. The British knew they couldn't get warships up the river because warships drew about 28 feet. and the mouth of the river only had about 10 feet of water. So what Richard Coote did is he sailed 2 ships from New London to the mouth of the river, and he deployed 136 Royal Marines and sailors in 6 heavily armed boats. These aren't little rowboats, these are big rowboats. They're basically the landing craft of their time. They carried carronades, which means cannons in their bows, and they were armed with Marines and sailors. First, they attacked the American fort at the mouth of the river, because it was a very important strategic river. When they stormed the fort at 11 o'clock at night, they found the fort completely abandoned. There were no men in it, no guns in it. And this was because a political argument between the government of Connecticut and the federal government. Connecticut did not want to be part of this war, and we said that no Connecticut troops will serve under federal officers. And the federal government said, we will not outfit your fort unless your men serve under federal officers. So the fort was abandoned halfway through the war at this critical moment. So the British get back in their boats, they row up the river, and at 3:30 in the morning, they arrive in the village that we now call Essex. Here's a picture of Essex today. This is the town here. Now, Captain Coote did not have to make his way in between all these fiberglass sailboats that night. This is what Essex looked like back then. The main street, shipbuilding around the village. When the British came in, 136 Royal Marines and sailors, they were met by about a dozen American militiamen at 3:30 in the morning. Because all of our militia was scattered throughout the countryside, and any alarm that was sounded would have sent militiamen down to Saybrook, to the mouth of the river, where we had expected an attack. So up in Essex, there was only about a dozen men with one little 4-pound cannon. So in the middle of the night, they heard something in the harbor, they fired their 4-pounder out into the harbor, they shot their dozen muskets out into the harbor, and figured, well, that's going to scare them away, whoever they are. And the British fired back with 6 carronades. These carronades are shooting 24-pound balls that can go half a mile. And they're shooting the muskets of 40 Royal Marines. And our men were overwhelmed, of course. And the British stormed the beach. Our men had to withdraw from the town. The British came in. They landed. There's Captain Coote with his Marines. And they started burning ships in the harbor. Throughout the night, they burned 25 ships. Now, our women and children left the town. They tried to get out into the countryside with their valuables. The men tried to get out of the harbor in rowboats and fight fires on the ships, but it was useless. Every ship in the harbor was set on fire throughout the night. A young boy, a 15-year-old boy named Austin Lay, went out repeatedly in a rowboat and tried to save one of the ships, even though he was hit by the British and threatened by the British. He was threatened that if he continued to try to put out the ships, his tongue would be cut out. We know that didn't happen because years later, when he was 87 years old, he was still telling the story about the night he tried to save the ships in Essex, so he escaped with his tongue. In the morning, the British recognized 2 ships that they hadn't burned, our 2 best privateers, the Young Anaconda and the Eagle, and they decided to take those out with them because those were worth a lot of money to the British. So at 11 o'clock the next morning, the British leave Essex and head down the river. But the wind is against them, so they're having to tack these 2 ships back and forth. And at about noon, one of the ships, the Young Anaconda, went aground along the riverbank. The Eagle anchored next to it. Captain Coote looked with his spyglass down to the bluffs now spanned by the I-95 bridge and saw Americans beginning to bring cannons onto the bluffs. So he knew he couldn't escape in daylight. So he set fire to the grounded vessel, and he determined to keep his men with this other vessel at anchor in the middle of the river in broad daylight for 7 hours until nightfall. And this is a very populated area of the country, halfway between New York and Boston. The American militia that had been chased out of Essex the night before come along the riverbank and start shooting at the British with their muskets. Now, it's not hurting the British. The British are in the river inside of a warship, and the muskets aren't doing much damage. The British also know if the Americans brought a cannon to the riverbank, the British could send their Marines ashore and destroy it. So the British were prepared to wait throughout the daytime and take the musket fire. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the American commander in the area feels pretty emboldened seeing the British out there at anchor being shot at, and he sends a surrender note out to the British, saying basically, Captain Coote, you did a great job last night, but it's over, you're all going to die, so in the name of humanity, save yourselves and give yourselves up. Captain Coote, being very British, insults the officer at how badly spelled the surrender request is, how bad the penmanship is, and he hands it back and says, thanks, but we're not going to surrender. Remember that in the World War II when the guy said nuts to the Germans? Kind of similar situation, he said nuts. So now, mobilization takes place from the forts in New London, and remember the American squadron from Stephen Decatur that's barricaded in New London by the British? He sends troops, American Marines and sailors overland. Soldiers and sailors come in from Killingworth, from Lyme, from Westbrook. And by 4:30, we have over 500 Americans on the bluffs that are now spanned by the I-95 bridge, and about 12 cannons. There is not a chance in hell the British are going to escape this river. They're up here at anchor. But then the Americans realized that the British are going to wait till after dark. And it was threatening rain. There's not going to be a moon. There's a very real chance that after dark the British might actually get through the river, despite all the cannons and men, because it's a very dark river, of course, without the floodlights of I-95's bridge. So we order a cannon to be moved from our gauntlet here through the woods and to try to get to the British positions and open fire on them with a cannon before nightfall. Finally, at 7 o'clock, the sun set. A cannon does reach the position and opens fire at point-blank range. The British are around 100 feet off the riverbank. So from 100 feet, this cannon opens fire on the British. If this had happened earlier in the day, the British would have sent the Marines ashore and destroyed the cannon and its crew. But now the British are burning the second vessel, which had been anchored. They're getting back in their 6 rowboats, and they're going to head down the river to escape. The Americans hit the boats and killed 2 British Marines and injured 2 sailors severely. But the British keep going. Now it's pitch black. All the men further down the river, at this big span with 60-foot bluffs, they hear this, so they open up with their cannons. So dozens of cannons are being fired from both sides of the river, echoing back and forth. Hundreds of men are firing their muskets at the river. The British are hit many, many times. But by 9:30, as the Americans listen to hear where the British are, instead of hearing the cries of agony in the river, they're hearing 2,000 men yelling 3 cheers and God Save the King. The British have reached the squadron and the Sound with their crews aboard, and the Americans realize the British have escaped. So 24 hours after this raid began, the British have destroyed 27 ships, the largest single maritime loss of the War of 1812, with a cost of 2 men killed and 2 men injured. The British were given medals, of course. It was big news in England. Promotions for the captain and crews. In America, it was a disaster. 90 newspapers across the country wrote of the disaster of Pettipog. It was a big disgrace. People lost their careers. It was obviously very alarming. But then the battle was forgotten. Why was it forgotten? Because a couple months later, the British attacked Stonington. The British burned Washington. They attacked Baltimore, the Star Spangled Banner. The Battle of New Orleans took place, and the war ended. So this little battle in Pettipog was forgotten. No one's going to build a statue to a battle that cost us 27 ships. So it was really forgotten over the years. We do have lots of artifacts put through the town, cannonballs, swords, muskets, different things. And then finally in 1982, an American naval officer, retired from Essex, went to a convention in Halifax, Nova Scotia, of other retired naval officers. He happens to be sitting, much like you folks are, having coffee next to a fellow who happened to be a Canadian admiral that was retired. And our guy, Al Dock from Essex, says, yeah, I'm from Essex, Connecticut. And the Royal Navy, the Canadian Navy admiral says, Essex, Connecticut? What a small world. I've been doing my family tree, and my great-great-grandfather was a British sailor who had been given a medal for being part of an attack on Essex, Connecticut back in 1812. And Al Dock said, that's amazing. Your great-great-grandfather visited my town 200 years ago. But we don't know anything about it. All we have is some rumors and some crazy parade. We don't know much about it. Well, the Admiral said, in my research, I have all of the British documents from the Royal Archives. I have the complete battle report from the British commanders. I have a list of all the ships burned. I have all of that. So he gave it to Al Dock, who came back, wrote this little book back in 1982. But it was a tiny little publication by the Essex Historical Society and more or less forgotten. As the bicentennial of the war approached, I went to a big convention in Mystic Seaport, where the Navy was presenting their plans for the bicentennial of the War of 1812, and all of the battles that they were going to include in their official battle site trail. And Essex wasn't on the list. And I asked the naval officer, how come you haven't included Essex? It was the largest single battle in the state of Connecticut, the largest loss of American shipping during the war. And that officer said, we never heard of it. There wasn't a book written about it. You're not a national battle site. You're not on our radar. So that happened in about 2009. So I set about with my staff to make sure we got on the radar. And we managed to get some good grants from the state and eventually the federal government to hire researchers here and in England to dig up all of these documents, to dig up the American documents. And finally, in April of 2012, we became the state of Connecticut's first War of 1812 battle site. We then got a large government grant from the American Battlefield Protection Program, and last summer we did 7 miles of archaeology looking for remnants of the battle, found all kinds of coins and bullets and cannonballs, all the usual things. We divided the river into 5 different battle site sections, and we had to get permission from over 150 people to dig on their properties. And it's amazing when you go to somebody who's got a multi-million-dollar home alongside the river and say, can I bring 30 people to dig up your lawn this summer looking for... Not a single person said no. One of the most interesting things we found is a gentleman named Andy Carr who came to a presentation just like this in Essex when I talked about this. And I talked about that British ship that went aground, the captured privateer, and was burned. And he called me the next day and said, Jerry, I know where the young anaconda is. I said, I'll bet you do. I said, where is it? He said, it's under my dock. So I went out there, and he has a dock sticking about 150 feet into the river, and there's a pile of stones under his dock. He says, I've been looking at these stones for 20 years, and I can't make any sense of them. I think that's the young anaconda. So I bring our archaeological team, and sure enough, this is the ballast stone. In the bottom of all wooden ships, they put stone so the masts wouldn't tip the ship over in the wind. And this was exactly the right size and shape to be the ballast stone for the young anaconda. Based on that, we put teams in there and determined it was. We also put metal detection crews on shore and found over 40 musket shot in the woods adjacent to the ship. That's the evidence of the battle between the ship and the American militia on shore. So this became a major battle site here. We did archaeology all up and down the river, and the last thing I'm going to tell you is you don't always find what you expect, and don't always expect what you find. So what we're looking for are swords, cannonballs, buttons, coins. But what you really want a button. Because a cannonball is a cannonball. An American 6-pound cannonball is the same size and shape as a British 6-pound cannonball. But a button, a British button, will have a regimental logo on it. And that'll prove that the British were ashore. And after weeks and weeks and weeks, someone finally shouts out, we got the button. We all go right into the woods where this archaeologist, this team had dug up the button. And there's the button. And gosh, were we ever excited about that. The button had crossed swords, a pile of cannonballs, and a British crown. This was a British regimental button. There was one odd thing about it. Most buttons in those days were single-piece stamped buttons, as opposed to the 2-piece buttons that are pressed together that we see now on blazers and things. And this was a 2-piece button. And 2-piece buttons didn't really come into active service until the 1820s. But still, we said, look, we've got our British crown, we've got crossed swords, we've got cannonballs. So in the modern way we do archaeology, we took a picture with our cell phone and sent that to our counterparts in England at the museum in Greenwich, where they could identify it right away. And we're all sitting around, patting ourselves in the back for finding this button. And the word comes back from England. Do any of you play golf? These are golf clubs. Those are golf balls. This is just a blue blazer stamped button off somebody's jacket that fell on the ground. But for a couple of hours, 35 archaeologists were pretty darn excited. And that's all right. We got our swords, we got our cannonballs, we got our shipwreck. We then created a website, which I invite you to go to, where we have all this information. We created a reenactment of a landing with British reenactors. We did the community bonfires. We did street banners. I wrote the big book on all of this after 6 years, and the book is available in the back if you're interested. We also did educational brochures for all the schools in Connecticut about this. And there's the book right there. And we created a battle site heritage trail. So now we hand these out at every rest stop in I-95. You can pick one of these up, and it tells you how to go to Essex and tour the battle sites. And there's a historic marker at each location where you can see and learn what happened in that phase of the battle. We put new exhibits in the Connecticut River Museum with the artifacts that we found. Of course, we had the big day with all of our reenactors and fun. And so what's next, you ask? Do you want to know more? My answer to you is read the book.
Read the book.
I will tell you a couple of things. We did find out who the traitor was. We found out who the mysterious torpedo jack was. We found him doing research in British law books in England. We also found out what happened to him. We also found out what happened to Captain Richard Coote, the British commander of the raid. Very interesting stuff. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Did you find the British button?
We did not find a British button. We found an American officer's button. But what's really interesting is I was having dinner at, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Dauntless Club. It's a men's club in an old house in Essex. And I always ask everybody, I haven't asked you guys yet, but I'm about to. I always ask everybody, do you have any cannonballs? Now, most guests don't do that, do they? But if you invite me to your house, I'm going to ask you if you have any cannonballs. Mostly people say no. But a waitress at the Dauntless Club said, you know, we have this doorstop over here. And the doorstop was a cannonball. And the cannonball was, I measured it out, it was a 24-pound cannonball. The Americans didn't have any 24-pounders. The British had 24-pounders in the nose of one of those boats that went in. And we've now found this missing cannonball that we had documentation of it being fired and found a half a mile inland the next day. And it ends up 200 years later as a doorstop in the Dauntless Club. So we didn't find the button, but we found a lot of cannonballs. And my favorite thing that we found altogether was, I was in my office one day. I get a call from down at the front desk that there's a gentleman here who's got a sword to donate to the museum. So I walk down, here's this gentleman who's retired and buys things at antique shops and donates them to the museum, whether we want them or not. He had a sword from the American Revolution, an American officer's sword from the Revolution. He had it mounted on a wooden plaque with a brass plate on it. American officer's sword from the Revolution found in Essex Harbor. And he was so excited to give this to us. And there was a group of people around, and I looked at the sword. And I'm not an expert on a lot of things, but I'm an expert on some swords, because I collect a couple of very specific swords. And I said to him, I'm sorry, Jeffrey, that's not an American sword from the Revolution. And his heart sank, because he figured, first of all, he'd been tricked at the antique store, and then he was embarrassed for donating this to us. And I said, Jeffrey, this is 100 times better. That is a 1804 pattern British Royal Navy boarding sword. It's what every single British sailor that came ashore that night had with them. And the only way that got into Essex Harbor was on April 8, 1814. That was the needle in the haystack that some kid found when he was raking for clams, pulls up the rusty sword, takes it to the antique shops, given 20 bucks for it. The antique dealer doesn't know what to do with it, so he says, American officer's sword from the Revolution. And by good fortune, the guy who bought it came and donated it to the museum, and one of the very few people who would have recognized that sword for what it was me. The rest of my staff wouldn't have known what it was. But it was just one of those things where things come together just right, and that's in the museum now. And that's better than a book. Any other questions?
Altogether, how many people were killed or wounded?
This was an amazing battle. It's an amazing, a great question, by the way. How many people were killed and wounded? And this is one of the reasons this battle is not as famous as it should be. Because we like our battles to be bloody, don't we? We like big body count. I mean, if it's a battle, a lot of people got killed, right? Well, here's a battle that involved over 500 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines, 136 Royal Navy sailors and Marines, 27 ships, the largest single loss of American ships during the War of 1812. 2 British Marines were killed and 2 sailors were wounded. 1 American officer was wounded. Remember that American officer that was firing at point-blank range at the British? As the British were rowing away in the darkness, he was so fast to fire his gun that they stopped sponging out the barrel between shots, and they accidentally blew up their munitions cart. And he was badly wounded when his munition cart blew up and burned his uniform. And we know that because years later, he applied for a pension and a new uniform based on what happened that night. So that was the American casualty. So very, very few casualties in quite a big battle.
One hell of a battle.
Well, one hell of a battle, that's right.
What happened to Coots?
All right. What happened to Coots?
What is it?
I should make you buy the book. My wife always says, make them buy the book. But here's what happened to Coot. And I'll take only 2 more minutes, then I'm done, because I know Lou's looking at his watch back there. Right? So Captain Richard Coot is 32 years old at this point. He is already a rising star in the Royal Navy. In 1813 alone, he has sunk or destroyed 24 American vessels. 2 years before this, in England, before he left on this voyage for the war, he had a fiancée, a beautiful woman, daughter of an aristocrat in London. Her younger brother was 15 years old, and he was a screw-up. He'd been kicked out of a British private school. And when somebody in the aristocracy gets kicked out of private school, what are you going to do? You're going to ship him off to the Navy, make a man out of him. So she begged her fiancé, Richard Coot, will you take my screw-up brother with you to make a man out of him? So he signs him aboard his ship as a midshipman, brings him to America, fights for 2 years with him, and on the night of the raid, that young boy came with him as a midshipman on the raid, chose his future brother-in-law to come with him on the raid. So a couple weeks after the raid, the woman back in England gets a letter. Not only is her future husband a national hero, he's going to get medals, he's probably going to get knighted, he's immediately been promoted high up the ranks, but her younger brother is written up as a hero as well. This is looking pretty darn good, right? So, a month after the battle, Coot is given command of a much larger vessel, the HMS Peacock. And of course he takes his young future brother-in-law with him to the Peacock, as well as some of his best officers. Torpedo Jack, we found out who he was. He was a man named Ezekiel Jackson. It's a long story how we found that out. But Ezekiel Jackson was paid $2,000 for his treason. $2,000 in those days would have bought you a very, very good house and allowed you to live in that house with everything you needed for at least 10 years. $2,000 had the buying power of $700,000 because that's what it would have taken out to buy a good house and live in it for 10 years. He was well paid. But he couldn't go ashore and spend his money. He couldn't go buy a Cadillac because now the Americans knew he was a traitor. So he signed aboard and went to the next ship with Captain Coot. So we have Captain Coot aboard the HMS Peacock with his future son-in-law, brother-in-law, and the traitor is now with him aboard the Peacock. So we're thinking, great, we do research all of the other young officers that Coot took with him that night, young lieutenants. Eventually they all became famous British admirals. Some of the most famous admirals in Arctic exploration and other things were young lieutenants during this voyage, because we had their journals. So what happened to Coot? Surely we would look next year and find Coot as Admiral Coot. Or at least a few years out, he'd be Admiral Coot. Didn't find him. Didn't find Admiral Coot. Didn't find Captain Coot. Didn't find Coot anywhere. How could a man disappear off the face of the earth after making such a monumental impact on the Royal Navy? So we went to the last place that we knew where he was, taking command of the HMS Peacock a month after this raid. And then we found out what happened, why there was never an Admiral Coot. Because in July, just a few months after this raid, which took place in April, in July the Peacock was going down the coast to join the British campaigns which were happening further to the south. And the Peacock was lost off of Cape Hatteras with all hands. So the woman back in England gets a letter. saying, now you've lost your future husband. You've lost your brother who you sent to sea with your future husband. She never remarried. We felt really bad about Captain Coote and the young boy going down the ship. But we did not feel bad when we realized also Ezekiel Jackson, the American trader, went down with that ship as well. We figured he probably got exactly what he deserved. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.